record on this computer. All right, got the recording going, and now we're going to go to the share screen. All right, so good morning to everybody. And today's topic will be modern science versus the Bible, transitional fossils. Now, this is a big one when it comes to Christianity versus modern science, because one of the things you hear a lot about modern science are, the proof of evolution, and we were all originally the exact same kind of creature organism, and then we spread over time. Is these transitional fossils? They say, we track how creatures have evolved over time, and like we've been talking about in previous lessons, that kind of goes against the biblical narrative, because the Bible tends to teach that we were all created in kinds, like we talked about not last week, but because we weren't able to do it last week, but 2 weeks ago we're talking about how the Bible says we're creating kinds. We can adapt to our environment. We can change. We have different skin colors, different types of hair. Some people grow taller, some grow smaller. And animals are the same thing. Some adapt to their environment, but we are still ultimately confined to our kinds. But transitional fossils are supposed to be evidence against that. So let's look at it. Let's examine it and see, you know, uh, does transitional fossils go against, would that disprove the Bible? I guess we're looking at the validity of transitional fossils this week. But last week, like I said, we talked about evolution or adaptation. Are we creatures really evolving, or are they just simply adapting to the environment? And we also talked about the gaps in traditional fossils and how there's not actually a lot of them like they're supposed to be. And we're going to hit that more in depth today. So we're going to talk a lot about specifically transitional fossils this week versus last week. We just simply mentioned it. So, but that's where we are right now. And without further ado, let's get into it. Now, transitional fossils, to begin with, what are transitional fossils? By definition, and I'm getting this from Merriam-Webster Dictionary, transitional fossil, a fossil that exhibits characteristics of both ancestral and derived forms. So what that means is that, to give you an example, if you look at our chart right here, the belief with evolution is that modern humans evolved from an ape-like ancestor. It's not supposed to be the same as apes, but I sometimes use the term loosely, but an ape-like ancestor. And these creatures in between us and the ape-like ancestor would be transitional fossils, because they are showing the changes over time, right? We start off as this ape-like ancestor according to evolution. Then at some point, these creatures start getting taller and start walking more upright. You see a little less fur. Then you see that they're even taller. You can see a rock in his hand. Then it goes to, he's sitting straight up. Now he's using more complicated tools. And then we get to the point where we get to the modern human, where we're supposedly hairless and we're using more complex weapons like the bow and arrow and spears and things like that. So that's kind of the idea of transitional fossils. It's the creatures that are showing the difference between whatever ancestor we have and what we are now. And it can also be relative to your time period. So, for example, let's say evolution is true, for the sake of argument, and millions and millions of years later, there are humans that can fly. And I use that example later, so that's the reason it came to me. But let's say we have humans that can fly later, right? We would be a transitional fossil because we can't fly, but we're supposedly on part of that development. We're part of that line that develops into, I guess, having wings or whatever, if evolution is true. But that's the idea. It's something that shows the gaps between whatever ancestor we want to trace our lineage back to and what we are now, transitional fossils. I hope that's straightforward. Now, like I said before, the problem is, though, we don't actually have a lot of transitional fossils. Everything on that chart in between this, well, they say ape-like ancestors, but the only thing we have is apes. The difference between us and apes, all this is made up. We don't actually have transitional fossils. These are all not real. We have variations of apes and we have variations of humans, like Neanderthals and people with different structures, but we don't have anything that's half ape, half human in between. We actually don't have any of those at all, and so that's a big problem in evolution. And even in cases where they do show transitional fossils, like I said last week, most of the time it's not actually different creatures. It's just simply variations of, it's different species of the same kind of creature. So this, all you see right here, except for this last one, I think this last one is significantly different, but the rest are, these are all horses. They're all, species of horses. They're not actually different creatures. And even on this one, we can debate if it's actually a horse or not, but uh, I'm going to talk more about the criticism of the transitional fossil charts they do produce. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the lesson, but there's not a lot of transitional fossils, period. And we know this, and scientists know this themselves. For example, if y'all recognize this guy, this is Charles Darwin, and he's considered the father of modern evolution, right? He made his discoveries, and he comes up with the theory of evolution that everything shares a common ancestor, or at least between humans and apes. We have enough similarities to say we the we originate from the same thing, from the same type of organism or same type of creature, whatever that was. But because of the lack of transitional fossils, Charles Darwin also recognizes the weakness of his theory. And we know that because he writes about it in his book, The Origin of Species. So if we look at The Origin of Species, chapter 6 and page 129, and this is from the PDF file I got it from. I don't know if it varies, based on if you look at the original book or not, but this is just a scan I got online. But here it goes. In the sixth, and this is Charles Darwin writing. In the 6th chapter, I enumerated the chief objections which might be justly urged against the views maintained in this volume. Most of them now have been discussed. One, namely, the distinctiveness of specific forms, and they are not being blended together by innumerable transitional links, is a very obvious difficulty. So what Charles Darwin is saying in the book, in which he's admitted himself, is that he says there are objections to his theory which are justly urged against him. He says this is justified. This is legit concerns against my theory. And he mentions two things. First, the distinctiveness of specific forms and them not being blended together. So, like I said before, not last week, but 2 weeks ago, we talked a lot about how God created us in kinds, right? We have similarities, but we were all created to be a specific thing. A dog is always meant to be a dog, or a canine type creature. A cattle is always meant to be cattle. Humans are always supposed to be humans. We can adapt to environment, but we do not transform into anything else than what we were created initially. And Charles Darwin is saying that himself. He says, I'm finding distinctiveness against forms, and I'm not really seeing a connection between them. And he also talks about, he says, if they are actually connected, we should also find a lot of evidence of it. He's saying there's a lack of transitional fossils. And he says this is very difficult, for my theory. This is a hole in my theory. This is something that you can justly argue against me. And he understands that himself. So he's definitely not lying about it. But that kind of goes more from what he's observing. That kind of goes to the biblical narrative, because the Bible says, I created everything after. God says, I created everything after a kind. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Charles Darwin is seeing, and something we still see in modern science. He also goes further with his point. Why then is not every geological formation in every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such fine graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. So just like I was saying before, there are missing links in the organic chain. And this is something that, like I said, Darwin admits himself. There are significant gaps. Not, and this is not uncommon. This is gaps in all creatures. A lot of creatures appear out of nowhere, according to evolution. There's no link to anything else. And it's not really explained. There is question marks between all these chains, and they know this, which is probably why they don't talk about it a lot. But it's there, and that's something a lot of people, I think, when you're taught evolution in school, or if you look at I guess, the modern theories about it and everything, they don't really talk about how unsolid these things are. There's a lot of gaps, and they just simply don't talk about it. And a lot of people don't realize it, because the impression you get is that they have this stuff solved. Everything originated from the same organism, and then we have transitional fossils, we have links and everything. And the fact of the matter is, we don't. We don't at all. We have creatures that are there for some reason, and there's not a link to anything else. But is that straightforward? Does everybody get what I'm saying? Any questions on that? Good. So I think we all get it, but there are significant gaps. So the question is, if there's so many of these gaps, how do the scientists come up with these transitional timelines? Like, where do they get the idea of to make these charts of transitional fossils, even though there is significant gaps between, I guess, the evolutions and the transitions between them? How do they create it? They rely on several things. One is the assumption that carbon dating and the geological record are correct. And we talked a lot about it before. Oh yeah, Matt and Tiffany commented, yes, definitely gaps in the theories. Yep. Um, but like we've talked about in previous lessons, carbon dating is very inaccurate. Geological record, I don't think we hit geological record too much, but it's kind of the same thing, because geological record is just simply putting stuff in order based on how deep is buried. So if something is buried deeper, it's probably older. If something is closer to the surface, it's probably not as old. That's kind of the general idea, but that stuff is uh very inconsistent, because there's a lot of stuff that can affect the geological record, like natural disasters, volcanoes burying stuff, maybe erosion, or floods or whatever. So, but but like I say, scientists historically, I don't know if they have better methods now. They may have improved their methods, but historically, they play with the numbers with carbon dating, and geological record is not always accurate at all. It is not. They're pretty much guessing at this point, at least historically, on how old stuff is based on carbon dating and geological record. There's a lot of assumptions, and like I said, when I did that quote, I think 3 or 4 weeks, I don't know how long ago, a while back, a lot of times they actually throw out the carbon dating numbers that they don't like anyway. So I don't think we need to take any of this seriously, but this is how they create these timelines. They put too much stock in carbon dating and the geological record. They also, a lot of it is also assumptions because of the similarities between creatures. So when they form these transitional fossils or these charts, and we're going to see examples in a minute of different transitional fossils, when they create these lines, a lot of times is what they're doing is they're finding creatures buried in the ground. They say, this has some interesting similarities to this creature, and they look at the physical appearance, and then they place things in the chart based on their physical appearance, and then they also will mix in carbon dating, geological record, and they try to mix it, but they'll manipulate the numbers. Not to say, I shouldn't say manipulate. I'm not trying to say that a lot of these scientists are bad people or they're just lying to you or anything. I'm not saying that, but uh, they will. It's very complicated the way they come up with the stuff, if that makes sense. A lot of it, I think, is influenced by how creatures look, but you don't really uh, know much more than that. They just look similar, and they say, maybe this is the ancestor of this because it has this certain features. So they really are just looking at pieces, and they're saying, like, let's make a chart based off, these physical features. But the Bible itself, the reason for the similarities, though, between us from the biblical narrative is because if we go to Genesis chapter 2, and I think I've read this before, but let's read it again. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And then if we skip down to verse 19, it reads, now the Lord God hath formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds of the sky. So the Bible literally says that God created both man and creatures out of the dust of the ground. We have differences because man has a soul, a spirit that goes back to God, where animals, as far as we can tell, just simply, they die, or, they don't have the same relationship we have with God. But but because we were created the same, we're going to have similarities between each other. That's in God's design. God made us similar enough for us to interact in this world, to create this cycle of life. We consume animals. So if we're going to consume animals and extract the nutrients we need from them, they have to be similar enough for us to get that benefit. If they're completely different from us and there's no similarities, if we eat creatures, it wouldn't do anything for us because there's nothing we can absorb from them. But God created us similar enough for us to create this life cycle, if you will. So that explains the similarities from the biblical standpoint. But scientists use this to say, no, we are from the same exact type of being, which is, goes against the biblical narrative. So I hope that's straightforward. I hope I'm didn't confuse anybody with the explanation, but that is part of how they create these transitional timelines. And then lastly, there's also a belief system that they will find dimensionally. And that's something they don't tell you a lot either when it comes to this transitional fossils, or even a lot of evolution in general. A lot of it is they have a belief system already, and they're hoping they will find more evidence for it. So it's not that they have solid evidence and then they're saying, no, this is true. It's really, they're like, I believe that I can find more evidence for this. So and there's nothing wrong with belief. I'm a Christian, so I have beliefs too, but it also shows that it's not really scientific at that point. It's more of people's opinion, and they're finding evidence to support their opinion. So that's why some people will argue against science evolutionists and say, y'all are just as religious as us as Christians, because y'all all operate off of faith and belief. So it's kind of a funny connection, but that is true to a certain extent. There is a belief system with this evolution. It's not just completely science and this is it. It's more, I believe I will find these links if I keep searching long enough. So that's how they create these timelines. So when we get to transitional fossils, where we get to actual charts of the ones that are supposedly more solid, or ones that show transition, there's still problems with these charts, or even or there's questions that need to be answered for them to be completely accurate. As you can see right here on your screen, this is the evolutionary chart for this word right here. I think Tiktaalik, I think is the name, Tiktaalik. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correct. But this is a creature that's real big in the evolutionary evolution circles, people who believe in evolution, is because they think it shows a connection between ancient fish and then the modern, lizards or alligators. It kind of shows uh, creatures transitioning from a fish-like ancestor and then going into being a land creature. That's kind of the idea. Something because the Tiktaalik, I think has, I think it has like half feet, and then maybe it has some fins or something, or they think it has fins on the bottom half. So it's supposed to be a transition. But there's a number of things that uh, are problems with transitional fossils. One is ancestry, and we're going to get into that in a sec. Another one is survival, and another is time. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. When it comes to ancestry, something you got to keep in mind about transitional fossils is that something's only a transitional fossil if it is in the same family tree. If it is not in the same family tree, then it's not a transitional fossil. The reason for that is because you can only inherit traits from your ancestors. If a something that is supposed to be a transitional fossil of you, it has to also be your relative. It has to be, you have to be descended from it, because if you're not descended from it, you won't get those traits in your bloodline anyway. And that's not a good explanation of evolution. To give you an example, they believe birds originated from, a land creature, right? The creature was original land, then at some point it grows wings, and then it eventually evolved to the point it is now, where it's a flying creature. But if this is not an ancestor of this, it's not going to pass off its traits. So if it's not passing those traits off to the modern bird, then the bird doesn't have the explanation of why it has wings, or at least it doesn't show a connection to this land creature. There's no connection there, if that makes sense, because the traits are not being passed. In order for something to be transitional, it has to be your relative. If it's not your relative, if you don't share the same ancestry, then you can't really track how this stuff evolved over time. And that's something with these transitional fossil charts they would have to prove. If they don't prove that they are actually related, you can't really show that they're that it's a path of evolution. For example, let's say, just to be silly, let's say humans learn how to fly, right? I'm gonna call this guy Falcon just because it sounds like a good bird name. Let's say Falcon grows wings, right? And he has children, and then his children end up having wings, right? That's not going to affect me because I don't have wings, right? Falcon has wings, but if I don't have wings, none of my descendants are going to get that trait from me. And there's no way for them to get the ability to fly unless they mix with his children, right? Because the trait doesn't exist with me. So none of my descendants are going to get it unless some of my descendants mix with his descendants, with Falcon's descendants. They have to be on the same family tree. If they're not on the same family tree, his genetics, his wings, or whatever, his adaptation will not show up with anybody else that is not his blood relation. So the point I'm trying to make is that evolution only works if transitional fossils only work if creatures are blood related. If they don't have any ancestry, then you can't really say they're connected. These different creatures are connected because the traits are not being shared between the two different creatures because there's no blood relation to pass on those traits. To kind of go further, this kind of also goes into my point about survival, right? I'm gonna use the analogy of football because I used to play football, so I'm gonna use this analogy. Let's say, for those of you that have played football, football uh, requires, in order to win the game, you have to score a touchdown, right? It's all about getting the ball across the end zone. So let's say um, the football player, for example, is the ancestor and the football itself is the traits, and he wants to pass it to his receivers, to his descendants, right? There's a process that has to happen. First, there has to be something to be passed. There has to be a football, there has to be some kind of adaptation. There has to be some kind of trait that's being passed. The center or the football player needs to pass that trait to the quarterback. That quarterback needs to receive the ball, and he needs to be able to successfully pass it to the receiver. The receiver needs to catch that ball, and then he needs to cross, the invisible plane in order to score a touchdown. That's how football works, and that's also how evolution works, right? Whatever traits you have to be able to survive. You have to pass those traits to the next generation continually and successfully. If any of you die along the point, if there's a fumble, if there's a sack, if there's something that interrupts you passing that trait on to your descendants will not get those traits from you, if that makes sense. So the problem that a lot of these uh, transitional fossil charts have is that they don't actually show the ancestry, and they don't know if these creatures are actually related. If they find a fossil of this, that doesn't mean anything by itself, because you also have to show its children, that this creature had children, and that the children had children, and then so on and so on, to in order to track the way they evolved. But if there was ever a fumble anywhere, if this creature did not produce any children, then that would disrupt your connection from this creature to this creature, because there's no connection now, because this creature didn't have kids. So that's another thing that a lot of people, that's another thing that they would have to prove in order to prove evolution. They have to show ancestry and that these creatures had children that survived, to show the links between different creatures. There has to be, that creature has to survive. But the problem is they don't bother showing that. They just say it's similar, therefore it's an ancestor, and that's not the case at all. Uh, you have to show the ancestry, because if it's disrupted anyway, then this whole chart means nothing. This whole thing doesn't mean anything. It just simply means that this creature is its own creature and it died off, and this creature is its own creature, but there's no connection from this group between this group. I hope that makes sense. Is there any questions on that? I know I said a lot, so I hope that is straightforward enough, but I don't see any hands, so I hope y'all get it. But that is something wrong, or something that they would need to prove with these transitional fossils. Also, another point, and this will be my last point, because I think we only got like 5 minutes left. Hold on, I gotta check. I like the football analogy. I appreciate it. I try my hardest on that. That's what somebody put in the chat. Like the football analogy. Now, the other thing I want to point out, and this will be my last point because we only got 5 minutes left, is also time. And what I mean by time is that it is very possible for different species of the same kind of animal to live at the same time. And what I mean by that is, let's take dogs, for example, right? These dogs are drastically different from each other, right? You have Dalmatians, you have whatever pit bull, or is it pit or bull? I don't know. Pug, whatever they call it. I'm not good with my dog breeds. Forgive me, dog lovers. But you see all this diversity among dogs, right? But these dogs are not evolutionary. They're not transitional fossils of each other, because these dogs are all living at the same time. They're different species, but they live at the same time. This is not a precursor to that, because they're all they're not related to each other, or at least not closely related to each other. They're just different species, right? So the problem you have with transitional fossils, if you rely heavily just on carbon dating, which is very inaccurate numbers, because you can't really tell how old something is on carbon dating, to be honest, or geological record. You can't just do it based on physical characteristics, because if any of these are living around the same time period, then this would disrupt the evolutionary transitional fossils. It would disrupt transitional fossils, because if these live around the same time, you can't say this is derived from that, right? Because they live at the same time. Then that eliminates the connection it has to this fish, right? They're not a clean scale because these lived at the same time. It's kind of like going back to the dogs. It's like, what if somebody, let's say millions of years ago, digs up the fossils of these dogs and say, hey, this dog is smaller and this one's bigger. This one must be a precursor to these. And they develop a transitional fossils based on just the way they look. But we know that's wrong because we're living this time period and we know that these types of dogs are all living at the same time. But with transitional fossils, what they do is they just look strictly on the characteristics and say, hey, this looks similar to this. This must be an ancestor of this, and this must be a descendant of that. But if you can't really uh, tell the exact time period, or you can't show that they really lived apart, and carbon dating to me does not count. Geological record doesn't count because that stuff is very inaccurate. You will disrupt your own evolutionary timeline. You destroy it. It's very, this stuff is very fragile. It's very easy to break these links, and they know this, and this is why they don't talk about it. Uh, because we know that it's very possible for creatures that are very similar but with different variations to live during the same time period, but it does not mean they're evolutionary, they're transitional fossils at all, because they live at the same time. And that's something else that they would have to prove. They have to prove its ancestry. They have to prove that they live far enough apart for evolution to have take place. And they have to disprove that they didn't live around the same time period, and that they're actually having descendants that pass on those traits. But like I said, they don't bother doing that because it's the only thing they have. So they have a belief system that they will find more evidence, but they don't actually have the evidence at all now. But what we do have evidence for us that have faith is that, and this is where our Christian, belief system comes in, because we're believers too. I won't pretend that we don't have to have science completely with being Christians. We are ultimately people that go live off of faith, but it just kind of shows, and I won't read Genesis just for time's sake because we're out of time right now. But it just shows that the Bible, from what we can see so far, that creatures did not evolve but remained in their kinds. The only thing we're seeing right now is that the Bible narrative is true, and that creatures, they can adapt, but they remained in their kind, and God created it to be so. So that's pretty much like my comments on transitional fossils. I'm sorry we ran out of time because we're about to start right now, and I know brother Parker got to start preaching, so we'll end it there. But is there any final comments or questions? I hope that was thorough enough. We kind of lost a little bit of time there, but I hope that was impactful and that you got what you needed from that.